Namaste, myself JVN Dr. K.K. Chaudhary, Faculty of Education and Methodology, JAYOTI VIDYAPEETH, Women University, Jaipur, Department of Science and Technology. And in continuation of this series of the lectures, now we will discuss on transport of the oxygen. The next session of the subject animal physiology and endocrinology of the course BSc B.Ed ZVC 4th semester. Today we will discuss about the transport of the oxygen. So first we should know about how the exchange of the gases take place. The exchange of the oxygen and carbon dioxide between the alveolar air and pulmonary blood occurs via passive diffusion, which is governed by the behavior of the gases as described by the two gas laws, Dalton law and the Henry laws. Dalton law is important for understanding how gases move down the concentration gradient, move down their pressure difference by diffusion, and Henry law explain how the solubility of a gas relates to its diffusion. If gas is more soluble, then what is the effect on the diffusion, and how the gases are transferred diffuses from higher partial pressure to lower partial pressure. So we should know first about the partial pressure. According to the Dalton law, each gas in a mixture of gases exerts its own pressure, as if no other gases were present. The pressure of a specific gas in a mixture is called its partial pressure. Pressure of a specific gas in a mixture is called partial pressure. The subscript is the chemical formula of the gas. The total pressure of the mixture is calculated by adding all the partial pressure. Atmospheric air is a mixture of gases: nitrogen, oxygen, argon, carbon dioxide, and variable amount of water vapors, plus other gases are present into the small quantity. Atmospheric pressure is sum of all these gases. So we can determine the partial pressure exerted by each component in a mixture by multiplying the percentage of the gas in a mixture by total pressure of the mixture. Atmospheric pressure is 760 mmHg. 760 mmHg. Atmospheric air is 78.6% nitrogen, 20.9% oxygen, 0.93% argon, 0.04% carbon dioxide, and 0.06 other gases, and a variable amount of water vapors is also present. Amount of water varies from practically 0% over a desert to 4% over the oceans, about 0.4% on a cool and dry day. Thus the partial pressure of a gas is inhaled air is as follows. The partial pressure of the nitrogen is 597.4 mmHg. Partial pressure of oxygen is 158.8 mmHg. Partial pressure of argon 0.7. Partial pressure of water 2.3 mmHg, and partial pressure of carbon dioxide 0.3 mmHg, and other gases 0.5 mmHg. If we add all these partial pressure, then it becomes the 760 mmHg. So the gases move from one place to another, yet diffuses from one area to another by the difference in these partial pressures. Means that these partial pressures determine the movement of oxygen and CO2 between the atmosphere and the lungs, between the lungs and the blood, between the blood and the body cells. Each gas diffuses across a membrane, permeable membrane, from the area where its partial pressure is greater to the area where its partial pressure is lower. Greater the difference in the partial pressure, faster the rate of the diffusion. Okay, gases move from higher partial pressure to lower partial pressure. If there is more difference, then there is the rate of the diffusion is increased. External respiration, a pulmonary gas exchange, is a diffusion of oxygen from air in the alveoli of the lung to blood in the pulmonary capillary, and the diffusion of CO2 in the opposite direction. External respiration, in the lungs convert deoxygenated blood coming from right side of the heart into oxygenated blood that return to the left side of the heart. As blood flow through the pulmonary capillaries, it pick up oxygen from the alveolar air and unload CO2 into alveolar air. Although this process is commonly called as exchange of the gases, each gas diffuses independently from the area where its partial pressure is higher to the area where its partial pressure is low. Then we come on the transport of the oxygen. Oxygen does not dissolve easily in water. So only about 1.5% of the inhaled oxygen is dissolved in blood plasma, which is mostly water. First, the oxygen dissolved into the blood plasma. When the blood plasma becomes fully saturated, then it moves next. Move next means it binds with the hemoglobin. Understand? 1.5% of the oxygen is transported with the help of dissolve when oxygen is dissolved into the blood plasma. Remaining 98.5% of the blood oxygen is bound to hemoglobin in red blood cells. Each 100 ml of oxygenated blood contains the equivalent of 20 ml of gaseous oxygen. In 100 ml of the blood, there is 20 ml of the oxygen is present. Using the percentage just given, the amount dissolved into the plasma is 0.3 ml and the amount bound to hemoglobin is 19.7 ml. Okay, means 0.3 ml of the oxygen is transported in the dissolved form and remaining 19.7 ml is transported with the help of the hemoglobin. The heme portion of the hemoglobin contains 4 atoms of the iron, each capable of binding to a molecule of oxygen. So, one hemoglobin molecule can bind to the 4 molecules of the oxygen. Oxygen and hemoglobin bind in an easily reversible reaction to form oxyhemoglobin. When oxygen binds with the hemoglobin, it is known as oxyhemoglobin, and when oxygen is removed from the hemoglobin, then it is known as deoxyhemoglobin. The 98.5% of the oxygen that is bound to hemoglobin is trapped inside RBC. So only the dissolved oxygen can diffuse out of tissue capillaries into the tissue cells. Thus, it is important to understand the factors that promote oxygen binding to and dissociation from the hemoglobin. Okay. Now, the most important factor that determines how much oxygen binds to the hemoglobin is the partial pressure of the oxygen. Higher the partial pressure of oxygen, the more oxygen combined with the hemoglobin. When reduced hemoglobin is completely converted to oxyhemoglobin, completely, the hemoglobin is said to be fully saturated, means कि 4 molecules of the oxygen bind with the 4 hemoglobins. When hemoglobin consists a mixture of hemoglobin and oxyhemoglobin, it is partially saturated. The percent saturation of hemoglobin expresses the average saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen. For instance, if each hemoglobin molecule has bound to 2 oxygen molecules, then the hemoglobin is 50% saturated. And because each hemoglobin can bind to a maximum of 4 oxygen molecules. The relationship between the percent saturation of hemoglobin and partial pressure of the oxygen is illustrated in the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. When the partial pressure of oxygen is high, the hemoglobin binds with a large amount of oxygen and is almost 100% saturated. And when partial pressure is low, hemoglobin is only partially saturated. In other words, the greater the partial pressure of the oxygen, the more oxygen will bind to hemoglobin until all the available hemoglobin molecules are saturated. Therefore, in pulmonary capillaries where partial pressure of oxygen is high, a lot of oxygen binds to a molecule. In tissue capillaries where partial pressure of oxygen is lower, hemoglobin does not bind, does not hold as much oxygen and dissolved oxygen is unloaded by diffusion into the tissue cells. Note that hemoglobin is still 75% saturated. With oxygen at a partial pressure of 40 mmHg, the average partial pressure of the oxygen is of the tissue cell in a person at rest. This is the basis for the earlier statement that only about 25% of the available oxygen unload from the hemoglobin and is tissue used by the cell under resting condition. When partial pressure is between 60 to 100 mmHg, hemoglobin is 90% saturated. Hemoglobin is 90% saturated and more saturated with oxygen. Thus, blood picks up nearly full load of oxygen from the lungs even when partial pressure of oxygen of the alveolar area as low as 60 mmHg. The hemoglobin partial pressure of oxygen curve explains why people can still perform well at high altitude. So, this is the transport of the oxygen take place. The various questions have been asked in various competitive exams UPSC, RPSC, REIT exams. Okay, the question arises in transport of oxygen. What is the external respiration? What is internal respiration? What is the partial pressure? How you can calculate the partial pressure? What do you mean by the partially saturated, fully saturated? What is the role of the hemoglobin? How much oxygen is transported with the hemoglobin? How much oxygen is transported by simple diffusion? So this is all about the transport of the oxygen. Hope you understand. Thank you very much.